Example mapping. This presentation is about a particular part within the Agile methodology, behavior-driven development, called example mapping. To briefly summarize the advantages of the behavior-driven development methodology, BDD, they are: reduced waste, reduced costs, easier and safer changes, and faster releases. However, it does depend on high business engagement and collaboration. It works best in an agile or iterative context, and it doesn't work well at all in silo organizations. Fortunately, the stated objective, both previously for BizNode as well as currently for DNB, is that we strive for the whole business to work towards adopting agile principles. And behavior-driven development is the development methodology that fully embraces agile principles, some of which are: our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. The most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. Working software is the primary measure of progress. Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Behavior-driven development is a test-first methodology. Test-first means development is directed by formulating assertions about how the code should behave, which the evolving code continuously must pass. Another name for it is test-driven development. They are in principle the same. The distinction is about the level at which the methodology is conducted. Test-driven development, TDD, is for directing creation of production code. Behavior-driven development is for directing creation of executable specifications. We leave it at that. The full details of behavior-driven development, BDD, is a whole different presentation. A lot of terminology here: BDD, TDD, executable specifications, example mapping. So what is example mapping and why should we care? Example mapping within the BDD methodology is the actual bridge between the business and the development, with a clear and intuitive approach of how to discover the inherent requirements of the features of the product that the business wants to build, and how these requirements can be formulated, virtually by recipe, to be turned into automatic acceptance tests during code production. Not after code production, during code production. That is what executable specifications mean. But before getting into the details of example mapping, let's look at another of its benefits: discovery. What do we mean by discovery in this context? Some may relate to the same expression in a different context, which, for the sake of unambiguity, I will call product discovery, since it relates to the creation of a better understanding of customer needs and expectations and the corresponding features that might address those. So, what is happening at these example mapping sessions? What are we discovering? Example mapping builds on that standard way of humans that interact with each other collaboratively to ensure that they arrive at the same understanding of what has been documented. Concrete examples are just little stories. Insightful people, like famous philosophers, renowned authors, and acclaimed psychologists, describe how storytelling is deeply ingrained in the human psyche. Storytelling is a fundamental part of being human. That's why the little stories that examples tell are so much easier to pick up instead of a generic specification. And when we say story, it's a story with real people, real values, real places. That helps people visualize it. The great thing about concrete examples is that everybody understands them. It's not technical. It is about how users are interacting with the software. Everybody can provide feedback and everybody has a different perspective, so you will talk about it until you can agree what it is all about. And the great thing about this is that it's rooted in the problem domain. What is the problem domain? Another buzzword. This term is from domain-driven design. There's the problem domain, which is where the users are, where is the business and the contracts and the options. All these real-world people, and we have a problem that hopefully we're going to solve by creating some software. And there is a solution domain, which is where people like the development teams operate most of the time, where we have the Kafka queues, the MongoDBs, and Java code, or Kotlin code, the JavaScript and front-end asynchronicities, and database tables and classes and methods, and so on. So when you write software, there are these two domains. Now, one of the big problems that probably everybody has experienced on projects is this communication problem. Because we don't speak the same language, we have completely different work situations. So there is a translation cost whenever we're having a conversation between somebody who's in the solution domain, which is typically a tester or a developer, with somebody in the problem domain. Inevitably, you're going to fail to properly understand one another. And if we can increase this area in the middle where people talk the same language, we'll have fewer misunderstandings. This is more about the people in a solution domain reaching out to the problem domain and trying to understand that domain, more than the other way around. That's why you are watching this presentation. If the people in the solution domain can understand the problem domain well enough, the solution will take care of itself. Because developing software is about creating a model of the real world. And if you don't understand the world you are trying to model, how can you create a good representation of it, unless you understand the problem domain? The ambition is to have this ubiquitous language. Yet another buzzword. What it means is that the same language is used everywhere and by everybody. The words that the business people use to talk about the problem have to be used in the solution domain as well, and have the same meaning in the code. There should be as little room as possible for misunderstandings to creep in. This is where concrete examples, talking through real-world examples, help. They help build this ubiquitous language because we're putting people from both the problem domain and the solution domain to be in the same room. It eliminates a lot of misunderstandings and everybody converges towards a more common language. Let's talk about requirements. The requirements of implementing a user story from the backlog so that it passes the acceptance criteria. How do we know, for a particular user story, what the requirements are? We have to remember that the backlog is not the requirements. The backlog consists of ideas for development at different levels of refinement. What is in the backlog will not necessarily be implemented. So being agile and following lean principles, we will not spend unnecessary time on things that we may never see go to production. Therefore, determining detailed requirement specifications will be deferred to the last responsible moment, which is when the story actually has been refined in groomings to the point that it is now ready to be pulled in for development. This is the time to understand the requirements of what needs to be done, not before we are ready to develop the story. Now we are trying to ensure that we all have the right understanding, or shared understanding, of the necessary requirements before we start doing any work. Consider the common situation where a lot of work had been done by product owners, business analysts, and customers, and maybe also others, to try and specify what it is that they wanted their development teams to do, what software they would like to be developed. However, when these large requirement documents made their way to the development teams, a lot of questions cropped up. People started asking about edge cases. They started asking about different contexts in which the specified outcomes or behaviors didn't happen in the way that they were described in the specification document. They wanted to know about other behaviors that needed to happen in parallel or at the same time, or that were related or connected. In general, the trouble with formal specifications is that they are often insufficient to give the development teams enough information to actually go and deliver the code, to create the implementation, without coming back to ask for further clarification. This isn't new. This has been happening since the days of waterfall, of forever. The requirements are presented to development, and even though they would seem clear to the people who wrote them, they were not clear enough to the people who had to implement the solutions. So, one of the first ways of interrogating any request that you get given that is not sufficiently precise is to say, "Give me an example how this is supposed to work." How does this fit together with example mapping then? This is a representation of the sort of canonical example map that might be created during an example mapping session. At the top you'll see a yellow card which has the word story written in it. This represents a single user story from the backlog that is going to development. The rules underneath are the behaviors that constrain the scope of that story. Any story talks about some benefit that some user is going to get from some functionality being developed. However, underneath the story there are requirements, there are acceptance criteria, there are rules that need to be implemented in the code. The code that we write essentially is an expression of those rules. But the story is usually quite ambiguous and is no substitute for a requirement. Even the rules, which, as we'll see, actually express the requirements, are also often ambiguous. So, using the notion of concrete examples allows the technical teams, and specifically the developers, to test their understanding of these rules by thinking of concrete examples. Essentially saying to the product owner or the business analyst, look for this story and this rule, is this example a correct statement of how you want the system to behave? And, if the answer is yes, it demonstrates that they had understood at least one part of that rule. But if the answer is no, then there could be a discussion about why that understanding is incorrect, and how it should be phrased instead. So there is learning. It's a way of communicating and arriving at shared understanding. Real examples connect the team to the existing system full of real inventory that they already have developed. One real thing connects to other real things. Frequently, teams make discoveries about functionality, design, and architecture when they get into concrete, realistic examples. Another thing that often happens is that people create concrete examples to question their understanding of a rule, and the product owner or business analyst, that is, there will go, Oh yeah. You know what, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. So instead of spending valuable time to discuss what could be the correct answer and possibly derail the intent of the meeting, capture the unknown on a red question card. And at the end of the meeting, somebody takes the question card and finds an answer before the next example mapping session. This is example mapping in a nutshell. It was mentioned earlier that the rule card is a replacement for requirements. Let's recap and point out that user stories are not Agile requirements. User stories, as created or conceived in the XP methodology, were placeholders for a conversation. They were ideas of things that we might develop, and it was a way of deferring detailed requirement analysis until there was a pretty good chance that that functionality was going to be prioritized, and that people were going to be available to implement it. The stories themselves are generally too vague, even when broken down into very small pieces of functionality, to really give a precise definition of what the behavior should be. So this idea of a rule is a generic placeholder for two terms that are currently used loosely in the software development and the Agile methodology world. One is requirement. There are formal specification methods, and the requirement word itself, within terminology, has got several different formal definitions. Though we are using the word rule here as a replacement for a business requirement, a specific expression of some behavior that should be implemented as part of a story being delivered. The other synonym is acceptance criterion. Our perspective, when we work with example mapping, is that the story has to deliver some behavior that is of use to somebody or something, using some entity, using the system, and the rule is an expression of some of that functionality. So you may think of rules as requirements, and you may think of them as acceptance criterion. Essentially, it is the behavior that has to be implemented for the user story to be considered delivered. So we use the word rule, and it's synonymous with requirement or acceptance criterion. There's no formal mechanism here for writing out rules. There are no shoulds or musts. It's just a description of a behavior or way we want the system to behave. Now, let's look at a demo of a practical example mapping session and how rules and examples get created from the conversation.
Yes, let's do this demo on example mapping. So, example mapping is a great way for software teams to agree on the details about what to build to avoid unpleasant surprises during development or after development. In this demo, we are going to show how to run an example mapping session in a team. As already stated, example mapping is a great way to discover what you don't know and what you need to find out before the team starts working on the new user story. Nobody likes to work on poorly understood requirements. Example mapping also enables a structured way to design acceptance tests collaboratively, and while doing this you often discover new business rules and refine existing ones. In doing example mapping, everyone involved, whether they represent the business or the developers, they can get a shared understanding of how the software needs to behave, and they can build the shared vocabulary to talk about it, thereby creating what is called a ubiquitous language. And if the user story is too big, example mapping can help you break it up into smaller pieces so that you can deliver them incrementally. As you can see, there are lots of benefits, so let's have a look at how it is done in practice. First, we need some stationery. We need a pack of 4 colored index cards like this, and you are going to need some fine point Sharpies. The ones that are a little bit thick are good for 2 reasons, because they are thick, which means you can't write very much on the card, and that's a good thing, and also it's easier to see from afar. The third thing is a big table without any clutter, just a clean surface. and we need a timer. One of the reasons why example mapping works well is because it is a really short meeting, and nobody likes long meetings. In terms of people, what is needed is a diverse group of people who all have a stake in the software. So typically this is a product owner, or a business analyst, a developer, QA, a UX expert, and it can also be a customer, or it can be support staff. Anybody who has a stake or some input into what the software needs to do, or if they're going to deal with it in some way or another. And finally, we need a user story from the product backlog. That is what we are going to work with in the example mapping session. We are going to examine what it is all about. So, the first thing we have is a user story. And this user story typically has a little bit of detail on it. Ideally, it doesn't have too much detail, because the purpose of the example mapping session is to discover this detail together. If there's too much detail on it, you will not have these interesting discussions where everybody gets to get familiar with the domain. So, just the right amount of detail. And, as you go along, you're going to discover different business rules that are associated with this user story or with this feature. For this, we use the blue cards. We're going to place them underneath. Normally, this is where most requirements end. You've got some rules or some acceptance criteria. And then that's it. Example mapping takes this further. After we have captured these rules, we are going to illustrate each rule with an example. So we use green cards for that. And every now and then, as you're doing this, people are going to have some questions. The interesting thing about examples is that they are so concrete, and it's a lot easier to picture things in your head when you've got concrete examples that illustrate a rule. That is when this happens. It's typically when you see an example that you come up with a question. Sometimes somebody else in the room will be able to answer the question immediately, but some of the time you're going to come up with a question that nobody has an answer to. In that case, you just write down the question on a red card and you stick it up onto the side. If it's a question only about the story, you can put it near the story. If it's a question about a particular rule or example, you can put it by the rule. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that you use these 4 different colored cards to represent different things. It's important to stress that the purpose during this meeting isn't to try to find the answers to everything. The purpose is to discover examples for the acceptance criteria of the story and maybe discover what you don't know about the story and capture that on green, blue, and red cards. Okay, so we're going to go through what a typical example mapping session might look like. Because this is a demo, there is no big group here. But I do have my friend Kate here who is going to help me, and you just have to imagine that there's a couple more people in the room who would make this discussion a lot livelier. We are going to be working for a fictitious train company who wants to improve their online booking of seats on trains. So our next user story is about optimizing how a booking works. And I've got a little card here, book train ticket. So that's the story. Let's get rid of this. Okay, the product owner would now typically give an introduction about what this story is. Or maybe a business analyst, or somebody who understands the domain. For this booking story, there are various business rules and policies around which seats may be reserved. So for a train, overall, no more than 70% of seats may be reserved in advance. That's to allow people who just show up right before the train leaves to still get onto the train. So no more than 70% of seats can be booked in advance. And ideally, no individual coach should have more than 70% reserved seats either. However, there is another business rule that says you must put all the seats for one reservation in the same coach. And this could make you go over 70% for some coaches. Just make sure to keep 70% for the whole train. Okay, so that was the introduction from the product owner. And during this explanation, some people in the session should be writing down some of those rules that they heard on blue index cards. Everyone who's present is encouraged to write those cards. So, let's put them out. So, we've got a rule here about max 70% of the entire train. And we have another one that says ideally max 70% of each coach. And all seats for one reservation have to go in the same coach. That's to avoid splitting up families, so to avoid that kids are sitting in one coach and the parents in another one. That wouldn't be very nice. Or maybe it would. I think sometimes. But here is a rule, we don't want to do that. So what we're going to do next now is to come up with some concrete examples to illustrate each one of these rules. These examples should include concrete values from our domain. So in this case, trains and bookings. What should we start with? We can start with where a coach is too full to place a group. I've drawn one here. Maximum 70% of entire train. So what you see up here is the initial train. There are 2 coaches in this train. There are 10 seats in each coach. In the first coach there are already 7 seats booked. And in the second coach there are 4 seats booked. And then somebody comes along and wants to book 4 seats. Then we end up with not getting any booking at all actually. Because if we allowed 4 more seats, that would mean a total of 15 seats booked on the train. But we can only book up to 70% capacity, which is 14. So this is an example illustrating what would happen if you go over that limit. So this is a sad path example. Let's come up with another one. Let's do this one. It's a happy path. There are 5 booked here and 4 booked here. We want to book 2, so we get those 2 seats booked. Now, this might throw out a question. Why would we put those 2 seats here? Why don't we put them here? Is seat allocation random? Or is there some hidden rule around how we allocate the seats? So, we could put up a question here. Is seat allocation random? Maybe somebody says, well, maybe we should put them here and here instead. So you see how concrete examples will prompt people to ask questions about particular rules. Maybe we have a hidden rule here, or an implicit or non-explicit rule about how they'll allocate seats when there are multiple options. Do we have any more? Let's do another one.
Nick, I have a question. If people can't book a seat, will we offer them a waiting list?
That's a good idea. Let's ask the product owner. Product owner says, oh, that's a good idea. I haven't thought about that. So initially we write up a card like that. But then it probably goes, no, I'm actually pretty sure we are going to do that at some point. I guess that's pretty standard in our industry. So instead of writing that as a question, we're gonna say we just discovered a new story. So, waiting list. We're just going to put that up here. That's going to go on the backlog. So, sometimes some people ask a question. It may be a question about what we're doing here, or it may be that we just discovered a new story.
Yes, and that allows us now to move on from talking about a waiting list, and we can keep our 25 minutes focused on booking train tickets.
Exactly right. So, I've got one more example here. All seats for one reservation in the same coach. Here we've got an initial train with the coach that is empty. And here we have 7 out of 10 booked already. Now somebody wants to book 4. So this is to illustrate that we don't put 3 people in one coach, but we put all 4 of them here. And then we just continue like that. We could come up with more examples here. We just keep going, and until we feel that we've covered all of the interesting aspects of each rule, or until the time runs out. One thing you might have noticed is that the examples that I put up, they have 3 elements to them. There's the initial state of the system, which is how many people are already booked. This is what the user is asking to do, which is to book 4 new seats. And then, this is the expected outcome. Put more generally, this is the anatomy of a typical example mapping example, a BDD example. It's got 3 parts, and this is good to keep in mind. You don't have to always write your examples with all of these elements, because it might be a little bit too tedious. Sometimes it may be sufficient to just mention a couple. But if you do it, you might be more likely to discover where there's a little bit of misunderstanding, and where people might have a different opinion, because it does make the examples very, very clear. Any other questions about this example map?
Yes. So, do we fill up the coaches, and do we fill up seats until the coaches are full? Or Do we spread out the seats across the capacity? I could see another option on the example you have for booking 4 seats. If there were 4 seats left in the first coach, would we fill that coach? Or would the booking still end up in the second coach?
So this one here. So you've got another example. Let me just quickly draw that. So, this. This. What's the initial? How many booked in this one?
6 booked in this one.
So 6 booked in this one. And how many booked in this one?
There's none booked.
None. Okay.
And we're trying to book 4.
Right.
So the question is, should they take those last seats in that carriage?
Right. So they go here. Or do they go here?
Yes. Do we want to leave capacity in each coach?
That's an interesting question. We have a rule there. A rule here tells us about that. So this is an indication that we should try to put them here. But there will be situations where we've got different options, and we can choose to fill up a coach or distribute the capacity. So I'm going to write that up as a question. Another question that comes up is how many seats are you allowed to book? Can you book the entire train? You can imagine football fans going to a game. Can they book the entire train? Is that fine? Or is there a maximum of maybe 10 seats that you can book?
Yes. I can see that as a rule.
Maybe we'll add a new question.
Also, how do you know when the train is full?
How do you know when the train is full? Good question. I guess that means how the customers could know when the train is full. But maybe it's a question that we shouldn't visit right now, so we'll add it as another question. How do customers know when the train is full? So as you can see, there's a bunch of questions which are coming up as you're doing this. We're going to stop here. We have illustrated the main idea. One thing that you might have noticed is that none of these examples use given, when, pen. During discovery, writing actual feature descriptions, given, when, pen, is not a good approach to this practice at all. Going into that level of detail during example mapping is strongly recommended against, because it's just driving people to tend to focus on the wrong things. It's focusing too much on language, when what you really should be doing in the session is use the opportunity to build a shared understanding of what needs to be achieved, and you can do that. In this case, we use drawings of trains and coaches and seats, because in this domain that conveys the business domain in an easy way. In a different problem domain, you would use a different kind of drawing, or maybe you would write it down. But I seriously recommend against trying to already use Gherkin at this point. It's much better practice if somebody translates the results into Gherkin after the example mapping session is over. Most likely this would best suit to be done by developers, since they are quite accustomed already to write texts that have to be syntactically correct. And with the people from the problem domain, product owners or business analysts, providing feedback on the Gherkin feature descriptions to secure that the examples have been correctly transcribed. It's the green cards that are candidates to become Gherkin scenarios. Notice also that there's no mention of user interface or technology used to implement the system. Here is a rule of thumb that is useful. Imagine it's 1920 and there are no computers. People were booking systems with trains in 1920 as well. It was all manual work, but you can imagine how they had exactly the same business rules back then. And if you think about it, many of the things that you do at your work might be something that people were doing 100 years ago without computers. And even if it isn't, try to describe the examples without talking about technology. Don't talk about the user interface. Talk about the problem domain. not about the solution domain. Another thing that you might have noticed is that we started out with a sad path example. That is where people try to book and then they don't get a booking. It's really useful to have both happy path and sad path examples to illustrate the rules from complementary angles. Quite often those sad path examples will expose ambiguities or other peculiarities that are not explicit about the rules. For example, one is the expected outcome that we don't make the booking if we go over 70% capacity. That there are more outcomes, right? What do we tell the customer? Do we tell the customer that they will get on the waiting list? Or do we tell them something else? So this throws up more questions. So when you're done with this, you take a step back and you look at the map as a whole. And if you are a business person, reflect on whether this example map captures all the information that you need to convey to the developers. Or is there anything missing here that you haven't said? If you're a developer, reflect on whether you have all the information that you need to start working and whether you think it can be finished in a sprint. And, in general, think about whether there is enough information to verify that the system works as expected once the story is implemented. And then we finish the example mapping session with a vote where everybody who were present get to do either thumbs up, which means yep, and happy to start working on this. And I think we've explained everything. Or you do thumbs down if you think that there are too many unknowns. When people do thumbs down, it can be for different reasons. It can be because there were just too many red cards there, or that there are just too many unknowns. That means that the story is poorly understood, and that the product owner or the business analyst needs to do some more research. And this is not a bad thing. People should not get disappointed when it ends with a thumbs down, since it's actually a good thing that you've discovered that you are ignorant about important details and that you need to clarify vague requirements. If there's too much blue or green, it means that the story is too big and you probably need to split it up. That would certainly be an indication that you need to split it up. So often you will find that you need to do 1 or 2, and sometimes even 3 example mapping sessions on the story before it's fully ready to be developed. However, once you have done that, you'll end up with well-sized stories that are well understood and that will just flow through the sprints without as many problems as what you might be used to. And the last thing you do is to take a picture of the example map with your phone, and then we can attach that to our story issue type in Jira. In our issue tracking system, which is Jira in our case, we can keep the examples that we have collaboratively worked out connected to the development stories. Currently, we don't have any specific, easily accessible tool that provides an interface to swiftly keep track of the progress of how the example maps get through production. That is, their corresponding feature descriptions that make up the acceptance tests, and by extension the actual executable requirements. As you remember, rules are synonyms for the requirements that delineate the user story, and rules are the crystallized expressions for the acceptance criteria that have been codified in the Gherkin feature descriptions that execute the tests to verify the behaviors. There are alternatives available, and we are currently looking into those to see if they would fit well within our development processes. So that after the example mapping session, we can continue and translate the green cards into our cucumber scenarios, and then proceed in the BDD, TDD double cycle with the TDD part as was shown in the beginning by the product development outline figure, and now based on examples that everybody has built, so they represent a shared understanding of the team. And that's example mapping in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Here is a question. Often user stories are related. Would you recommend example mapping several stories in one session?
Yes, that really depends. You could probably do that when you start to get the hang of it. But preferably you would just do one at a time. I would recommend that people do the example mapping as late as possible at the last responsible moment. Because if you batch them up and do lots of example mapping for stories that you may not start developing until several weeks from now, you're going to have forgotten all of the interesting conversations that you had around that example mapping session by the time you start developing it. And a lot of the things that you talked about might even be out of date. A rule of thumb is to just do one at a time, to the next one that you're going to start working on, and defer doing more until right before you're going to start working on them.
Okay, thank you. Another question. So, how do you recommend going from an example map to Gherkin?
Yes, that's a great question. So I mentioned I recommend just taking a picture of the example map and attach it to your ticket in Jira. And when it's time to start working on it, which is hopefully within just a couple of days later, you take each one of those examples and you turn them into a cucumber scenario, which will drive your TDD code production.
Right. One more question. If practicing Scrum, should we still wait just before we work on the ticket to do an example mapping session? Or do we example map for each story individually at the top of the backlog? When in the process do you recommend people run these sessions?
Well, so one of the things Scrum says is that you need to figure out your own process. That's one of the key principles of Scrum itself. So the blunt answer is that you need to figure out what works for you. A recommendation is to do it before you commit to how much you are going to take on into the next sprint, and also before you do estimation. The reason is, imagine that you are doing estimation, and then you're committing to doing certain number of stories based on those estimates. And now you've got a number of stories that you are committed to do. And then do example mapping. You are going to discover that some of the stories that you committed to are actually a lot bigger than you thought they were. Oops, so now you have committed to too much. Would it not have been nice to know about that before you committed? Remember, the reason we're doing example mapping is to discover all the things that we don't know, and also to get a shared understanding. The main value is to discover early on all of the things we don't know. And you really want to do this before you put an estimate on something, and before you decide you're going to work on something. So try to do it before the sprint. Using the number of green cards is a good estimate for the size of the story. How many examples do we need to be able to say how big this thing is, or to understand this thing to determine a good size for the story? Also, I should point out that even though using cards is shown here as a very good and efficient method, cards might not necessarily always be the right way to capture your examples and to talk about them. It's really important to not get boxed in by that and think that that's the only way to do it. Really, the key thing is to be using the examples to understand about the rules, the acceptance criteria that define the story, so that we know when we are done. The goal is, at the end of a discovery session, which will have been attended by, not the whole development team, is that the example map that have been captured, whether it be in cards or whiteboard, or however we decided was suitable for that particular rule, that it is sufficient to capture the conversation, and therefore it gives anybody else who wasn't in the room enough information to pick it up and work on it. So, even if it would be optimal if those attending the discovery also worked on implementing it, it's not strictly necessary. We should be capturing enough information to let anybody do it. Because remember, the ultimate goal is that in 5 years' time, when all involved have been promoted or moved to other organizations, and a new team has come in and has to maintain this product, that documentation should still be sufficient for them to understand how the product was designed to behave. To summarize, example mapping is something that you do just in time before starting development on stories. It's your discovery phase. And if you do this well, you will write much better cucumber scenarios, because the feature descriptions will be based on a shared understanding of the problem domain. And you will also be much better at automating the acceptance criteria that were discovered and doing test-driven development. You bring up questions about unclear parts of the stories that will be developed, which means that you don't have to start working on stuff that isn't ready. So you get that early feedback that you're not ready, which is great. You get smaller stories or better-sized stories, and you get much better estimates, and you get a shared understanding with ubiquitous language between stakeholders and developers, which is also a big win. That's example mapping.
So this was a simple example mapping session played out. Examples themselves come naturally to us and we use them in our day-to-day life, so there's nothing special about examples. But we should consider what makes an example, how we should frame an example. A good example, well, all examples exist in a context. So, the context that we were talking about in the demo is a booking system for trains. Then, there is an action that causes the behavior that we're expecting or that we desire. So in a given context, if someone takes this action, then something happens, and that something is an outcome. This is the anatomy of every example that you have ever used or worked with. Let's look at it in the demo. Here we have a situation where we have 2 carriages, and in one of them there are 3 available seats. When we then go to book 4, according to the rule, we must choose the carriage that has enough seats for all 4. But what is the context? The context is in the story together with the rule, and further detailed in the example. This is demonstrating that example cards can omit the full context, because the context may be implicit, or at least encoded elsewhere in the example map. In this case, the context is in the example map. There's a number of different ways that you can capture an example. There is the prose way. It's a completely non-formal mechanism to use and capture examples in any way that makes sense to the assembled people in the room. But it is not the only way. The important thing to keep in mind is that the examples that are captured should be understandable and effective for everybody within the domain. Priority should be put on high bandwidth communication and not formalism. So if an example is better expressed in a spreadsheet, use a spreadsheet. If a photo is better than text, use a photo. The most important thing is that everybody that is involved understands what the example intends to illustrate. The ultimate goal is to maximize the understanding between everybody of what is expected and what needs to be done. So we have this idea of example maps, and the example maps have a story, and they have some rules that limit or describe the scope of that story. They have some examples, and they begin to build out details about what the team actually should work on. And the really nice thing about example mapping, as well as giving you a structure around which to hang your conversation to ensure that you reach a shared understanding, they also give you some really quite tangible visual feedback about the state of understanding of a particular story. For instance, if we have a lot of rules and a lot of examples, we could be getting to the point where we're thinking, is this story too big? Is this story well enough understood? Here we have a story that has 2 questions outstanding. If we have many questions outstanding, is the story ready to begin work on, to begin developing on? The answer is quite probably no. If a story has huge numbers of rules that it delivers, is it maybe too big? Could we split it? The answer probably is yes. If the story has many examples illustrating some rules, could it be that the rules are too ambiguous? The answer quite probably is yes. If, however, you have a story that looks a bit like this, maybe you've got the right number of rules. Each rule has got sufficient examples. There's one outstanding question. Maybe it's a vague one that doesn't need to be answered now. Maybe we could be ready to start working on this story. This visual feedback that you get from the finished or the partially complete story map is extremely valuable. Practical experience shows that in many cases example mapping can be a substitute for refinement of user stories, and that the visual feedback of the example map can be a very reliable guide for estimating story size before development. Note that example mapping is a structured and practical technique for collaborative discovery. This is a very important point and therefore worth repeating. Example mapping is a practical recipe for how to conduct a discovery session with expected outcomes. It has a structure that tells you what to do and how to conduct the meeting, and it has expected results that informs you about the next phases in your development that you are about to embark on. It provides you with clear outlines of feature descriptions that can directly be used as behavior tests, and it clearly defines the acceptance criteria that will determine if you are done with the story, the executable requirement. Many times, discovery is shown to be a very valuable tool for increasing understanding and collaboration, but without much practical guidelines of how to do it. Discovery is at the very core of example mapping. Example mapping is not simply a factory, generating little stories to become test scenarios. The real benefit of its usage is the conversations generated in the creation of these new examples. To work properly, we must have conversations between the business and development. We must keep doing it iteratively, because it is during discovery that we start testing what it is we understand about what we need to build for the product that we want. It is during discovery and example mapping that we start to create the acceptance criteria for the product, together with examples that clarify how it works. And these examples can be directly used to create automated acceptance tests in, for instance, the Cucumber framework. The example mapping rule, the acceptance criteria, define the expected outcomes, and the developer's job is to write the code that produces those outcomes. This is a very efficient, focused way of working. Just as no feature is implemented unless it contributes to an identified business goal, no code is written unless it contributes to making an acceptance test pass, and therefore to implementing a feature. Example mapping is a real and practical recipe for bridging the communication gap between the business and the development, something that is sorely missing in traditional practices where formal requirement specifications are only handed over in document form from product management to development teams and testers to do their best to interpret what to actually do with them. Doing the right thing is more important than doing the thing right. There is nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency something that should not be done at all. Example mapping is also an integral part of the Agile methodology behavior-driven development, BDD, one that fully follows principles as stated in the Agile Manifesto. So when an organization is set to adopt Agile methodology, BDD should be one vital part of that transformation. Something should also be said about team constellations for BDD. As mentioned, BDD does not work well in siloed organizations. In fact, the development team in BDD is not really only the team consisting of developers, as traditionally, and still to this day, is the norm. Rather, the true development team in BDD is a team where developers, business analysts, quality masters, and product owners work in tight collaboration almost daily. User stories from the backlog go through example mapping to create shared understanding that aid in formulating acceptance criteria which become automated tests, continually ticking of backlog items in a steady and predictable pace. Software development is knowledge work. In knowledge work, we need to manage for creativity. We are generating something new rather than just incrementally improving on the past. This means there is no way to precisely define the goal in advance because there are too many unknowns. Software development is knowledge work, and Agile development is fundamentally a considered response to this situation of not knowing the exact goal and how to reach it. Agile promotes embracing and adapting to change to be the chief concern of the development process. Thus, teams doing Agile development optimize for discovery. As the manifesto for Agile software development says, software development is inherently a discovery process. From a quality perspective, we want all parts of the development chain to work smoothly. High quality means outstanding products. But outstanding products are not achieved accidentally by chance. All parts of the machinery must work well. A chain is never stronger than its weakest link. If we want to deliver outstanding products that our customers can rely on, without qualms, with a high pace of new functionality, we have to make sure that the various steps, from inception to feature discovery, to automated testing and continuous product delivery, iteratively and incrementally, are executed as well as possible.